This morning, Dr. Charles Krauthammer is going to ask answer a question potentially for us that everyone is curious to know, and that is, how did we end up here? Dr. Krauthammer, he writes a syndicated column for the Washington Post, which appears in more than 400 newspapers worldwide, and for which he won the 1987 Pulitzer Prize. As you all are probably very well aware, he is a Fox News commentator appearing nightly on Fox's evening news program, Special Report with Bret Baier. His latest book, Things That Matter, 3 Decades of Passions, Pastimes, and Politics, a #1 New York Times bestseller, has sold more than 1 million copies. Born in New York City and raised in Montreal, Krauthammer was educated at McGill University, Oxford University, and Harvard. While serving as chief resident in psychiatry at the Massachusetts General Hospital, he co-discovered a form of bipolar disease. In 1978, he quit medical practice and came to Washington to help direct planning and psychiatric research at the Carter administration. In 1980, he served as a speechwriter to Vice President Walter Mondale. He joined the New Republic in 1981. 3 years later, his New Republic essays won the National Magazine Award for Essays and Criticism. A fantastic mind and talent. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Charles Krauthammer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay, I'll take silence to mean assent. I had a speech which I had to throw out yesterday afternoon. It was going to be a learned historical dissection of how we got here, but I'm no longer sure what here means. As of noon yesterday, I was going to talk about how the election was over and why we had come to where we had come to. But the election is now reopened, and we're now in a situation where no one knows where we're going, because no one knows what Comey is talking about. He's talking about, and incidentally, if somebody had written a television script for this campaign, and now that hangs on the private correspondence and the laptop of Carlos Danger, they would have said, we can't, this is really too ridiculous. I was thinking that even in banana republics, you don't get this. Maybe it happens in coconut republics or something. The one thing I wanted to point out, and I'll skip with any learned introductory paragraphs, we know that this has now thrown the Clinton campaign into disarray, and they, of course, don't know what to do or say because they don't know what exactly is being examined. But there's one thing I think that's been kind of overlooked. If Hillary Clinton still wins, and as of today I would guess that the odds are slightly in her favor, they are not the 8-to-1, 9-to-1 odds they were just a few days ago. Imagine the kind of constitutional crisis we will be in. She will be under investigation by the FBI. She either could be indicted. We've never had a president-elect or a president indicted in office. Or even if she is not, for sure the Republicans will begin hearings, and it is quite possible that impeachment would begin fairly early in her term. The only equivalent would be Richard Nixon in 1973. By August of 74, he'd had to resign because he was about to be impeached and convicted. And that was only, 16 months after he'd been sworn in for a second term. And he won with a landslide, more than 60% of the vote. So it is quite possible that rather than having a fresh slate, which is what we do when we elect new presidents, we would sort of start her presidency in the middle of this sleaze and corruption. And so that I would think would be one of the reasons why a genuinely undecided voter might decide either to stay home, leave the line open. I'm not sure they would shift over to Trump, but she might lose a substantial proportion. Perhaps not a substantial, but even if it's 1 or 2 or 3 points, in many of the swing states, that's enough to swing the election. So that, I think, is something added on, which I think will become more and more weighty as we approach Election Day. The question, though, is how did we get to here? We are a country of 330 million people, and we've ended up with these two. And then there's Gary Johnson. What is Aleppo, Gary Johnson? And you say to yourself, what exactly is wrong with our process that produces candidates like this? To some extent, it has to do with the impact of television and celebrity. I mean, the great asset that Trump had coming in is that he was known. 14 years on a hit television show. It's not because he was a businessman. It's not because he wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, but he had name recognition higher than anybody else from the very beginning because he was a television star. And people have said, well, Ronald Reagan was an actor, yes, but he was a 2-term governor of the largest state in the Union when he ran for office in '76 and then in 1980. But I must say, whatever the process is, it has produced the two most disliked, unpopular candidates in the history of polling, which is saying a lot. For me, it's been, of course, a bonanza because it is the craziest election I've seen in my lifetime, and I am uniquely qualified to deal with crazy. In my youth, when I was practicing, I actually spent a year as the chief of a locked psychiatric ward. And I can tell you that it was far more sane than what I'm covering today. Because it was interesting, when you are in those circumstances, around once a day you have to stop and remind yourself that you're the sane one in here. So the two most unpopular candidates in history. And I remember saying this at least 18 months ago when people were talking about all the advantages that Hillary would have when she was running. Hillary, I thought from the beginning, was one of the weakest candidates in modern American political history. First of all, as we know now, she came in with more baggage than Delta Airlines. And then she showed her political weakness when for a year she couldn't shake a 74-year-old socialist Brooklynite who, and this is my favorite part, honeymooned in the Soviet Union. That I didn't make up. That is true. And as Lindsey Graham, my favorite senator, added, yes, and he never returned. My first clue, or it wasn't mine, but the first clue as to how weak a candidate she was when she effectively announced. That's when she began her book tour and did an interview with Diane Sawyer that night, in which she said that when she and her husband had left the White House, they were broke and had trouble paying their mortgages. Politics 101. When pleading poverty, do not refer to your domiciles in the plural. My second clue was when the email revelation first came out. I think it was on a Tuesday. And on that Friday, around midday, her campaign manager said, there's not a shred of evidence that she did anything wrong. Now, if you're in the commenting business, as I am, that is a gift from heaven. Because by 6 o'clock that night, I was on the air saying the obvious. Of course there's not a shred of evidence. She shredded the evidence. Her other problem is not that she lies and lies continuously, or as William Safire once wrote, congenitally, but that she lies badly. This is where she could take lessons in lying from her husband. Her husband is a successful liar because he's so charming and sort of roguish, and he gets away with it. She is not charming, and she's not roguish, and she does not get away with it. My motto, incidentally, in Washington, ever since I got there, is to always tell the truth because it's easier to memorize. She doesn't memorize well. And in the notes that I prepared just 3 days ago, I've written here, I can see, she's on a glide path to the presidency. That was written on Wednesday. And there really was no way that Trump could make up the distance. You can't make up 7, 8 points, which is roughly what the polling difference was in the course of 12 days. And there was nothing that would propel a Trump surge. Now, there'd been a slight narrowing of the race as a result of two things. Number one is an actual real issue, the shock announcement of the increases in Obamacare premiums, which was predictable and predicted, and it was also predicted to hit just about in this year for 2017, 2018, but nonetheless hits several million voters right in the pocketbook in real life. It's not a theoretical argument anymore. And remember, when Obamacare was being argued theoretically in 2010 and then in 2014, it completely destroyed the Democrats' electoral chances and resulted in the shellacking, as Obama called it, of the two midterm elections. It was the number one issue, and it resulted in a disaster. Or as a friend of mine said about the 2010 midterm election, that wasn't an election, it was a restraining order. And it was a restraining order because when Obama lost the House of Representatives, his entire legislative agenda died. He was able to get Obamacare through when he controlled the two houses of Congress for 2 terms. But remember, well, you would know this very well because it was directly related to what you do. But he tried to get cap and trade through. And even with the 2 majorities he had in the houses, in the House and in the Senate, he wasn't able to. That was simply a bridge too far. I mean, you know, Obama, in my view, and one of the reasons I think Trump is a result in many ways of Obama, is not a conventional liberal as we understand it. You know what a liberal is. A liberal, somebody who doesn't care what you do as long as it's mandatory. And the Clintons were conventional liberals. Bill Clinton was a centrist liberal, sort of left of center. She, I think, instinctively is more to the left than he was. But by this point, 30 years into her career, I don't think she knows what she believes anymore. And I'm not sure there's anything left to genuine political or ideological instincts. She's a creature of her party, a creature of its factions, and goes with the wind. As we saw in the primary election, she had declared the Trans-Pacific Partnership while she was Secretary of State as the gold standard of trade deals. And then when Sanders began to go around the country denouncing it, and when Trump brought up trade treaties and propelled him to the top of the heap in the Republican primary, all of a sudden she discovered that it did not have all the virtues that she thought it had. So she really is a finger to the wind, sort of production of the Democratic Party and its factions, which incidentally is why she's kind of my favorite kind of liberal. I like liberals who are utterly cynical and believe in nothing, because that way they can sometimes accidentally do the right thing. With a Bernie Sanders, it's hopeless. He would always do the wrong thing. So if you had to choose among Democrats, always choose the one who is the most corrupt and principleless, if I can make up a noun. So on one hand, we have her, historically very weak, and then we have Donald Trump, who, in my view, was, just in terms of appeal to the general electorate, the weakest of at least a half a dozen candidates on the Republican side. I think, let's sort of think before yesterday, before the revelations. I can imagine that a Kasich or a Rubio or even a Jeb, although he was not the ideal candidate, would be ahead by 10 points. Again, given Clinton's weakness, and also given the fact that Hillary is running as status quo and heir to Obama. She's essentially running for Obama's third term. And there's simply no doubt, if you look at the wreckage that Obama has left both economically and in terms of geopolitics, that the uneasiness in the country, the anxiety, and the fact that, and the one that Trump deeply understood and tapped into, was that there is a sense of American decline, which I think is very real. And the fact about Obama is that he chose decline. I mean, liberals like to argue that it was inevitable, we overreached, we overstretched. That's total nonsense. The fact that we had an unsuccessful, unpopular military adventure in Iraq is no more or less, it's infinitely less of an expenditure of energy and treasure and blood than was, for example, the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War was followed by the Reagan restoration, when you could argue that America hit the peak of its power when the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 1990s and totally dominated. So I don't think that the fact that we've had difficulties and we had the financial collapse of 2008 accounts for the deep-seated feeling. That deep-seated feeling of decline comes from the results of Obama's chosen retreat from the world, and again, predicted and predictable, that when a superpower decides to leave an area like the Middle East, or to leave involvement in Europe, for example, washing our hands of Russian aggressions, what happens is the vacuum is filled by others who generally tend to be hostile and certainly very much opposed to the liberal world order that we have lived in since the Second World War. So there is this palpable sense of decline. We have the weakest economic recovery since the Second World War. We had about 1% growth. We did get a good number coming in last week for this quarter, which is almost 3%, which, could be an anomaly, we don't know. But certainly the cumulative effect of 8 years of anemic and even no growth leaves this kind of sour feeling in the electorate, which sort of set us up for a change of hands in the White House. Historically, you can go back to 1952, to 6 decades, and except for once, every time one party has held the White House for 2 terms, it gets unceremoniously kicked out. The one exception was 1988, of course, where Reagan's successful 2-term presidency was rewarded with, as it were, a 3rd term of George H.W. Bush. But normally people get really tired of incumbent administrations, and they had more reason than ever to think so about Obama. And added on to that is one other thing. We are historically and almost by inheritance, or have been for this generation or two, a center-right country. If you do the Gallup, look at the Gallup polls going back about 3 decades for ideological self-identification, you find that about 40% of Americans identify as conservative. Give or take, it waxes a little bit and wanes. 20% liberal and 35% moderate. You'll notice that 5% have no idea what the hell's going on. Of course, they're the ones who decide elections, but you can't have everything. But we're generally a center-right country. And when you stray, as Obama has, with Obamacare, with the attempted cap and trade, with this kind of heavy regulatory burden he's been trying to impose on the country, when you stray and you go way beyond the 40-yard line, we're basically a country where ideological wars are fought between the 40-yard lines, as opposed to Europe, where it goes goalpost to goalpost. True fascist parties, true communist parties on the other side. If you go beyond the 40-yard line, and I would argue that Obama was trying to take us into the red zone, no pun intended, the country rebels. And we saw it in 2010, we saw it in 2014. It didn't happen in 2012 because he ran against a particularly weak opponent. So that sets up the other side to win the election, which would have been the natural outcome. It all became unnatural when Donald Trump became the nominee. And the reason it's unnatural is that, and this is the other anomaly of this election season, for the first time in 40, maybe 50 years, we have a presidential election with no conservative in the race. She's a liberal, and he is a populist, which is a perfectly defensible political philosophy, but it's not conservative. In fact, when asked about that, and that was the main criticism of Trump very early on, in one of his rallies, I think in California, at the end of August, he said, "Yes, of course I'm a conservative, but at this point, what does it matter?" It's not very important to him. And remember, he unveiled Ivanka Care just a few months ago, which was a very heavily federalized and regulated system of mandated leave, maternity leave and child care, that any liberal would have been proud of. It's the kind of program that a Bernie Sanders would have proposed. So he doesn't quite have any particular instincts. And you see it often, the mistakes he's made when asked about abortion. He's saying you have to punish the woman. This is a liberal trying to figure out what conservatives are supposed to say. And on some issues, he can't quite figure it out. And that makes him so unusual. So the question is, what exactly was the appeal? And to me, it was sort of 2 things. He tapped into the fact that Republicans and Democrats have become alienated from and quite deaf to the suffering of the losers in this globalized, liberalized, international trading system that we have. And that's something that conservatives are going to have to appeal to. We all know since David Ricardo that trade is net a good thing. It always is. You can prove it. It's one of the few political things you can prove mathematically. But the fact is that is the net benefit to a country. But the net is the sum of what happens to individual constituencies. and the fact that so many of the less educated, less literate, less sophisticated parts of the population, the ones who lived a very good middle-class life in the pre-information age, in the industrial age, and could have a secure middle-class life as factory workers, that is disappearing with the new information economy and with high levels of trade with countries whose wage scales are less. And ironically, liberals make that worse because we can compensate for higher wages by having the unbelievably efficient energy industry that we have. So particularly in natural gas, because its prices are local and not global. So we have this advantage to offset higher wages. And of course, what do liberals want to do? Shut down as best they can these sources of advantage that we have in the economic race. But nonetheless, that's what he tapped into. And he did it very effectively. I wasn't very happy with the way that he mixed in a lot of xenophobia and sort of anger, unmitigated anger, directed at the other, when so much of this has to do with the internal inefficiencies and corruptions of our own system. But nonetheless, he did that successfully. The other thing he offered, which I think was overlooked, the main theme of his campaign is strength. If you look at his speeches, and you don't because you actually have real lives, you do things, you make things, you sell things. I, on the other hand, for my sins, have to follow these people 24 hours a day. Obviously, my sins are many. But if you listen to as many speeches of his as I have, the word strength appears in every other sentence. We have to be strong on borders, strong on defense. We have to be strong on this. I'm strong. I'm the one who can do it. And I was thinking about that in the context of one amazing anomaly in Trump's support. He won the evangelicals in the Republican primaries. This is a man who has no business winning evangelicals. He hasn't quite lived a pious evangelical life. Ted Cruz is the son of a preacher. That was his strategy. Win the evangelicals, sweep the southern states, and then you go on to the West, win the nomination. But it never happened because Trump trounced him among evangelicals. So the question is why? And it occurred to me in a speech he gave at Liberty University, which, as you know, is a religious evangelical university, in which he, at one point, trying to ingratiate himself with the audience, quoted scripture and gave the citation as 2 Corinthians. Not exactly how you're supposed to say it. And it indicates that the man hasn't seen the inside of a church in several decades. And I must say, you know, Trump has this thing about tweeting. And that night, I rarely tweet, but that night, I really couldn't help myself. So I simply tweeted out, 2 Corinthians walk into a bar. I got several hundred responses. Probably should do a small book from that. He loves to tweet, and on the day he announced, I kind of took off after him on the air for talking about Mexicans being rapists and all this stuff. And I said that he was appealing. Well, I called him a rodeo clown on the air. I kind of regret the rodeo part. I thought that was, I could have left it out and still achievement. So he got very upset that night, and he tweeted about me, the usual, dummy, over the hill, should be fired, loser. And then the last one was my favorite. It came around 2 a.m. I imagined him in his pajamas, in his royal gold-plated bed, And he tweets out, 2 weeks earlier, my book had come out in paperback, and he retweeted the publisher's tweet about it. And it says, "Things That Matter" by Charles Krauthammer, now out in paperback, to which Trump added, "Book sucks." Which I read that the next night on the air, saying that it was the shortest review I'd ever gotten. And I told my publisher that if they ever do a new edition, to wipe clean the back cover with all the blurbs praising me, I said I want just one quote. "Book sucks, Donald J. Trump." It'll be out soon. Look for it in bookstores near you. But this is what impressed me about that Corinthians thing. He clearly is not one of them. But then he followed that little misstep with the following statement, which is a very interesting locution. "I will protect Christianity." Slightly grandiose, but no more than usual for Trump. And I began to understand the appeal. He was talking about Christians being persecuted in the Middle East. He was also talking about the encroachment on the faithful in this country by the secularists in Washington and elsewhere, who sort of walk all over religious beliefs and religious rights in a kind of uncomprehending way because they have no affinity for that kind of thinking. So what Trump was saying was this: I'm obviously not one of you. I can't even quote scripture correctly. But I will protect you. I will be the centurion standing outside the cathedral on patrol and protect you, your way of life, and your co-religionists. And with that appeal, that was the appeal. You're under attack. You don't need a preacher. You need a warrior. You need somebody who will take on the forces that are trying to undermine you and protect you. And it's that kind of thing, strength, protection, I'll keep them out, that I think was the key to his appeal. Not just for evangelicals, but to the other parts, especially the white working class who've been in many parts of the country devastated by the changes, social and economic. It's not just the loss of economic security and stature, but the fact that all these other minority groups are now claiming rights and privileges that were not accorded to working class whites. So that's where he gets, and it's quite an achievement. I'm not a fan, but I understand what his appeal was. And I'll conclude by looking at what I think is the question facing Republicans. I still think that he's likely to lose, although it is shocking how the polls have changed. The Washington Post tracking poll had Hillary up by 12 points last week, and as of last night, it's 2 points. Now, I don't think there was a 10-point swing. It was already because of the latest revelation, but I think the gap was already closing. She had had a very bad week. Obamacare numbers, obviously the WikiLeaks, the memo about Clinton Inc., personal enrichment for the Clintons, the memo written by Doug Band, the corruption of the Clinton Foundation because of its lack of boundaries with personal enrichment for the Clintons and also with her actions in the State Department. So all of this comes pouring out. The numbers are tightening, and then you get the bombshell. I still think, though, of course, impossible to predict because who knows what more will be revealed. But assuming she wins, what happens to the GOP? And the answer is it all depends on Trump. Trump's constituency is a kind of independent militia. It's Hezbollah inside of the United States. They're not, I've never said that. I hope if there's anybody from the press, that was meant as a metaphor. He is not, just to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying he's an Iranian-backed terrorist. But it's this kind of core constituency, completely loyal to him. Notice how it survived the release of the Access Hollywood tapes. Remember, he once said, if I went down Fifth Avenue and shot somebody, I wouldn't lose any of my supporters. Well, he didn't shoot anybody, but he sort of acted very strangely, and he hasn't lost them. They will follow him, and they now constitute a permanent, I think, a permanent part of the GOP party, the GOP. And it is not, again, conservative. It is populist. And I think what we're going to see, assuming if he wins, he will change the party, same way that Reagan did. It will become ideologically a populist party, and then probably the GOP will split, because where do conservatives go? They will naturally, over time, want to set up a new Republican, a new conservative party. But the same could happen if he loses. If he decides he wants to stay in politics, which I think he will, because he's not the kind of guy, he's not Cincinnatus or George Washington, who will get on his horse and retire to his estate in Trump Tower. I think he tastes how important he is politically and the power of leading a constituency as wide and as committed as his. There's a guy who got a plurality of the votes in the GOP primaries, who commands 39% of the general electorate, which is a pretty large number. And he doesn't answer to anyone on that. These are people loyal to him, not to any party, not to any group, not even to any ideology. He can change his views, as he has somewhat on immigration and on other issues, and they still be with him. So I would imagine that there will be a Trump element, a Trump wing to the Republican Party. Whether he continues to lead it, I'm not sure, but we could quite possibly see some young opportunist in the party who would go that way and take over. But I'll leave you with one indicator to see whether and how strong this faction will be. This will be about 2 months after the election, whether Paul Ryan survives as Speaker of the House. Trump carries grudges. He talks about that openly. He feels, and he mentioned it just 2 nights ago, that Paul Ryan has sort of let him down. Sometimes he says betrayed him by not giving him the support he thinks he deserves. And Ryan is being targeted by some of the insurgents in the House on his speakership. And should he fall, which is possible, I don't think it's probable, but it's quite possible, I think that would be the work of the Trumpite faction in the House. And that would be an indication that he's now kingmaker and power broker. In other words, Trump continues as a major political figure, one of the most important in the country, if he decides he wants to do that. Now, he may decide he'd rather make a fortune with Trump TV, which would be a competitor to Fox and would take half of Fox's audience. I know that's the half of the Fox audience that writes me angry emails every day. So I know who they are, and they know where I live. And that will be, in other words, the landscape will be changed no matter what. So we are in a very precarious constitutional position. On the one hand, we may elect someone who will carry legal liabilities into the White House, which happened with Nixon, although we weren't even aware of how deep those legal complications were. When Nixon was elected, he wouldn't have gotten 60% of the vote had people imagined what had really gone on. That was pre-email, and that people didn't realize what went on until the tapes were ordered released by the Supreme Court. Today, you don't need the Supreme Court ordering the release of tapes. Emails are everywhere, and they are eternal. I think we have to add to the phrase, death, taxes, and email. Those are the three things that will always be with us. So you've got one candidate who could just begin with a constitutional crisis, which could be solved, by the way, by Obama issuing a pardon, which I think I would say would be likely, simply as a way to clear the slate. But that would not prevent impeachment, so that would continue. On the other hand, you have a Donald Trump, who I think is, let's just say, be very new to the job and may lack the discipline required to deal with a 3 a.m. phone call. And the third alternative, as some of you have considered, would be the libertarian Gary Johnson. But anybody who says, what is Aleppo, maybe is not quite prepared to assume the role of commander-in-chief. By the way, we had him on special report. We have this thing where we would invite candidates to come on the air, and we would question him on the panel. So we had Gary Johnson, and I had the first question, and I simply asked, how long has it been since you last smoked marijuana? And his answer was quite impressive. He said, 5 weeks. I mean, he was completely open about it. And he said, well, I haven't been doing it, and I wouldn't do it in office, but it is legal, and he's been doing it recreationally. Because he actually was in the pot of business before he began running in some enterprise in Colorado. So we've got three candidates, all of whom carry tremendous amounts of baggage. And the country has gotten itself into this fix. There may be a larger philosophical answer to say, well, we were inevitably headed this way because, and I attribute some of that to the celebrity culture and to television. But in other ways, this is simply a confluence of accidents and independent actions which have given us this truly peculiar and actually quite dangerous constitutional situation. It's sort of amusing because of how improbable it is, and because a guy like Carlos Danger is at the heart of the tumult in the presidential election. But that makes it sort of, I've been shown, by the way, the tabloid headlines today, and they really tell you what a national treasure are the headline writers at the New York Post. But beyond the amusement is, we shouldn't be anywhere near this kind of situation where the FBI essentially can decide an election one way or the other, or influence it very heavily. But that's where we are. Let me just end on this note, optimistic note, because I hate leaving my audiences depressed. I have on occasion. I hear moaning and weeping from the back of the room. And my general approach is to offer my services as a psychiatrist and offer to write prescriptions for antidepressants for anybody who needs them just to get home that night. But let me cheer you up rhetorically rather than pharmacologically. And I've always been impressed, even though I really think we're in a pretty bad place right now, by the sort of providential nature of American history. Whether you believe it's the hand of the Almighty or something more simple. But just consider our history. In the late 1700s, we produced the greatest generation of political geniuses ever to appear on the planet, producing documents most especially the Constitution, that invented out of whole cloth creates a system that has survived intact for a quarter of a millennium. By comparison, the French, who had their revolution around when we did, are on their fifth republic. We are on our first republic. And the reason I had to add that is because I really can't go a full hour without at least once mocking the French. So that was just a personal tick that I had to give. In the 19th century, we needed a Lincoln, and we got a Lincoln. In the 20th, we needed FDR to get us through the Depression and the Second World War. In the second half of the 20th century, we needed Reagan to revive the country when it was deeply depressed and in retreat, and also in the midst of great post-Vietnam self-doubt, and he succeeded in doing that. Now, I don't stay awake at night praying for miracles and for a new Ronald Reagan. We're not going to get one. But I remain impressed by the fact that in American history, things generally turn. And to me, whether you believe it's the hand of God, to me it's the bedrock of decency, common sense, wisdom, generosity, and love of liberty of the American people. Churchill once said, Americans always do the right thing after having tried everything else first. Well, we have just spent 8 years trying everything else, and we may spend the next 4 years trying everything else. But I do believe that eventually we're going to get it right. Thank you very much.